And during the Q&A, I just would like everybody to identify yourself before you ask a question to let us know of your affiliation. So it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome Ismet Fatih Čančar to the Harriman Institute. I had the pleasure of working with him before last year at New Lines Institute in Washington, where I am a senior non-resident fellow. I published a monograph on the security posture in the Western Balkans, and Mr. Čančar wrote the piece, the profile on Bosnia and where it stood. And as many people know, Bosnia is really in the crosshairs, as is Kosovo. But there are, of course, mitigating factors around all of that. Anyway, without further ado, my name is Tanya Domi, and I teach here at Harriman in our Balkan Studies program. And I'm very proud of the programming that we do here. It's some of the best programming in the country on the Western Balkans. And we're situated well here at the Harriman Institute, which has served, I think, in terms of Balkan studies and more broadly, we present a lot of interdisciplinary events and discussions, and I think we do a pretty good job of it. So I'm really delighted to welcome you here. Mr. Čančar is a political economist and a researcher. In 2024, he was awarded a Fulbright grant. Unfortunately, he's at SAIS right now. I wanted him to come here, but you know, he stopped in Washington and got stuck in that madness. Anyway, previously he has served in the Bosnian Ministry of Security as an advisor, and he is also was in charge of, in that capacity, he was in charge of bilateral and multilateral affairs portfolio. He's also worked at the Partnership for Peace Fellow at the NATO Defense College, where he's focused on NATO integration and collective defense and security posture in the Western Balkans region. So without further ado, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear colleagues, guests, thank you very much for being here today. I'd like to start by stating that the European collective security has been fundamentally shattered with the invasion of Ukraine. What has been known in the theories of political economy as the peace dividend that we have enjoyed for the past 80 years, that the European continent has enjoyed, is now over, with the realization for the first time in a long period that war, brutal conflict has returned back to Europe. And this invasion shattered convictions of primarily secure, stable post-World War II European order, in which, safeguarded by the United States under the NATO umbrella, the European continent would never again experience a war. This has obviously been proven wrong with the invasion. Within the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina has been recognized as one of the most vulnerable points in European security framework. How do we know this? We know this simply by, first of all, the level of activity that has happened in the region, but also, in essence, former Secretary General Stoltenberg, in his visit in 2023, late 2023, towards the Western Balkans, he started it in Bosnia, and famously, besides clear messages of support towards the Bosnian state, stated that he is concerned about the increased Russian influence in the country. This has been repeated earlier last month by the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who said that he's particularly concerned about the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that NATO will not allow a security vacuum to emerge in Bosnia. This can be seen as a continuity of NATO's very vigilant support towards countering primarily foreign malign influences, but is also an indicator, and it's clear why the Western Balkans and Bosnia specifically are a central force to a, as they call it, prosperous and free region, and therefore prosperous, free, and at peace Europe as part of central or strategic interests of NATO and the United States. It's also understandable why for the pro-Bosnian forces, NATO remains a strategic goal and wishes to build long-lasting relationship with the alliance. What kind of relationship do we have? You know, does the Bosnian state have with NATO? It's in very short terms. It's been a member of the Partnership for Peace since 2006, and then at the summit in Tallinn in 2010 has been invited for the membership action plan. This is the almost final step before the full-fledged integration. Since then, there's been no traction in achieving that final step. However, in its relations with NATO, Bosnia and Herzegovina is not just a security consumer, and we often talk about this in security topics. What does a state, by entering an alliance, offer to that alliance? So Bosnia is not only a security consumer, it's a security provider as well. In what ways? In a couple of ways. Besides its vast experience in both high-level exercises with the NATO members and NATO alliance, including here in the pictures you can see a couple with American soldiers in Bosnia and in Europe. It has in 2022 the light infantry battalion group of the armed forces have been NATO certified, meaning it's now combat readiness is up to standards of NATO. In theory, that means that if there is a need for deployment of the NATO forces, Bosnia and Herzegovina could contribute directly to the strategic and security posture of NATO across the continent. Besides that, there's a number of PFP activities that the state has done, including putting upfront a number of forces, especially in mine disposal, where we have a niche, unfortunately, due to the previous war in the 90s. The Peace Support Operation Training Center is a NATO accredited center that does training for NATO members and partner states that work with NATO on a number of different issues, including peacekeeping missions. And among else, the Bosnian state and the Bosnian army has contributed, including towards the missions of the United States in peacekeeping in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Congo, in Central African Republic. So in many ways, you know, it's been part of the actual collective Western security posture. Am I?
Because
Okay, that's good. So
there's actually, I just want to say, there's actually an office in Sarajevo, a
Yes.
NATO office there. By the way, a lot of people don't know that.
absolutely, there's a NATO office there. It's been now further bolstered with the invasion, and it's also what we're about to talk about, and that in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, NATO has recognized this increased threat towards the Bosnian state and has decided to first create and then adopt a tailored defense capacity building package in 2023, which aims to further enhance the interoperability, military interoperability between the armed forces and the Bosnian state. But overall, it is essentially to increase the Bosnian capacity to resist foreign malign influence in the Bosnian state and to build more resilient institutions, both in defense and security sectors. And this has been, if I'm not wrong, the last time is, I think, between $48 and $53 million of support in the defense and the security field. Despite this robust level of support and relationship between the two sides, the actual accession of the Bosnian state to NATO is complete. And there's two reasons for that. One is this domestic factor, on which, unfortunately, the Dayton Agreement, the constitution of the Bosnian state, has centered ethno-national camps in the Bosnian political framework, which carry ethnic veto power in decision-making processes over state-level institutions. And these veto powers have been used to ensure blockades and obstruction of any kind of real movement towards Western political and security institutions, especially in this regard. The Republika Srpska leadership with Milorad Dodik at the helm, the president of RS, which is one of the two entities within the Bosnian state, has used this veto power to stifle any kind of integration. And these activities, it is very important to contextualize this in a larger picture, have been closely coordinated with Russia. The Russian idea here is to continue the disintegration of the Bosnian state, and using attacks on the territorial sovereignty and the independence of the institutions. And I've put here a quote from that very well summarizes the Russian ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina, who just after the invasion, a couple of weeks, threatened the Bosnian state if it was to move towards NATO, that the Russian side would respond, and used the famous phrase Ukraine's examples show what we expect from the Bosnian state. This is obviously, I mean, a serious issue to what we can expect. This synchronized approach of both Dodik and Putin is a way in which the Bosnian state remains in perpetual state of fear, of inadequacy to respond to any current situation, and also in which in future it cannot fully defend itself based on any possible escalation of opportunities. So in many ways, the Dayton constitutional network has been abused, and this has been seen by the Russians and been quite astute in using the disadvantages of the Bosnian state in order to continue the subversion of the Euro-Atlantic security in the region, and consequently in the European collective security framework. I put here another quote that I think is very important, and that is one in which much recently, late last year, I think in December, the Russian ambassador to Serbia went on famously to state that that Russia will continue protecting Dayton, that is, all the rights of RS acquired through Dayton negotiations, while also making sure to use its position as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council to protect Serbia's interests. Why is this the case? We come to the external dimension, and the external dimension is that the part of the axis of threats to the Bosnian state come essentially by Serbian ultranational irredentism, and this is best reflected in again after the invasion of Ukraine, in which pro-Russian actors in the region, Serbs in Bosnia, major political parties in Serbia proper, openly started advocating for a unilateral revision of sovereign borders in the Balkans according to the Greater Serbian ideology. And for those of you who are not aware of that, the Greater Serbian ideology is, or Greater Serbia ideology today, rebranded in Srpski svet, or Serbian world as we would know, is a relic of the 90s. Ideas based on logic of blood and soil, in which all Serbs need to live within one state, regardless of where they are. This is obviously a huge red flag. Redrawing borders in a way this has been presented is an existential threat, not only for the Bosnian state, not only for the region, but also for the European security, because it directly contravenes or goes against what the central pillar of the Washington Agreement of NATO is, and that is the sanctity, the inviolability of borders and the territorial integrity of states. So it targets these basic pillars in a way in which it has long-lasting consequences. And I put this here because this is what it looks at in real life. You can see here. You can see here. You all know these people, but all of these interlocutors are members either of the Serbian proper establishment or members or leaders of Republika Srpska leadership. And the greater Serbian ideology in practice means something such as what Alexander Vulin used to say in 2022, who used to be the chief of intelligence and also Minister of Defense and Minister of Interior Affairs, not wrong, who said that the task for this generation of politicians is to form a Serb world, that is to unite Serbs wherever they live. Same messages are echoed coming from Dodik himself, the president of RS, who believes that it's a phenomenal idea and that the Serbian national question has not been resolved yet and needs to be resolved in this century. I mean, in practice, we can easily, quickly simulate potential scenarios and understand that it's quite easy to predict what this would look like. Geostrategically, secession of RS, which is the main goal of the leadership there, with Russian support, de facto creates something along the lines of Balkan Transnistria. An ideal lever to foment and exacerbate and push further external interference in regional and continental security affairs. This is same as in Ukraine, and I want to bring Ukraine in this conversation by looking into, since 2014, the breakaway regions, in which these regions have been used by Russia as levers for external influence, meddling in internal affairs of the Ukrainian states. And this is where I think the first lesson can be drawn. Based on what we see here, we understand that despite the internal turmoil that's currently present, NATO remains the premier security institution in the transatlantic relationship. Now, obviously, no one can possibly know what this means, especially with what the future of Euro-Atlantic alliance is, especially with the new presidency in town. But in simple terms, NATO for Ukraine and NATO for Bosnia represents the same thing, and that is a long-term security guarantee that keeps primarily borders intact. When you position this along the lines that other assurances historically speaking, the Budapest Memorandum in case of, for example, Ukraine, or even a higher level of presumed support in terms of Dayton Agreement have shown to be fallible, then the logical solution is to seek for a more binding insurances. And these are obviously something that both states are looking for. The question is whether these are achievable under current conditions, under the idea that offering any kind of direct commitment of NATO support would affect the credibility of the Article 5. And this is something that is being talked and discussed about right now in Washington and Europe, and we've all witnessed what are the possible outcomes of this. We are coming to the point in which the credibility of Article 5 cannot credibly be guaranteed even to members of the NATO alliance in case of any type of peace plan that offers some type of peacekeeping or peace ensuring mechanisms to which leads me to say that business as usual is impossible. And when I say business as usual is impossible, I mean the idea that as was the position of NATO, especially during Secretary Stoltenberg, that somehow there needs to be a consensus for integration in NATO, is simply an unattainable goal. And this, together with Moscow, with the support of local proxy actors in Banja Luka and Belgrade, will remain the case. Now, this is a situation that, in essence, perpetuates instability and potential conflict on a long-term scale. And in a way, it's maintaining this ability of Russian proxies to block the integration of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, in NATO, remains one of the most effective platforms for the incorporation of Russian geostrategic interests in the Balkans. This obviously opens a vacuum for Russian and Chinese influence, other foreign influence that are going to encourage further divisive rhetoric, secessionist goals, and Serbian within the Serbian establishment and the Serbian nationalism. Such a case represents a significant pressure for NATO, if nothing for the continuous need to uphold the status quo, which becomes more expensive as years goes by. I think that we can project this broader and say that other international players, specifically Russia and China, understands that concepts such as national sovereignty and inviolability of borders prevent them from attaining these imperial goals that have been here historically. Regardless, they have built and in some cases even recovered strength in recent years to try to either directly risk these safeguards through flagrant breaches, or have tried to do so, flagrant breaches being, for example, the invasion, obviously, or try to do so in indirect means through hybrid warfare. It's also something that can very much be connected with what's happening in Ukraine, and that's the final peace plan. The outcome in Ukraine will either inspire or extinguish these desires. If a peace plan partitions Ukraine along the lines of what is being talked about right now, if it allows Russia to keep vast control of territories, if there's a surrender of national sovereignty in that regards, that is a permanent lever for Russia to foment further crisis, not just to Ukraine, but to the rest of the NATO alliance. Now, I'm not naive to think that these issues are easy to solve. One has to be realistic, and this does not mean that we should integrate Ukraine and Bosnia and Herzegovina in NATO regardlessly of what happens. There needs to be a thinking along lines how we do so. However, the Bosnian case, for example, is a sui generis case. It's a specific case that has simply shown that the peace plan, that the internal mechanism of dealing with ways of how we shape or how we organize a society have become 30 years after the Dayton Agreement have become incapable of containing some of these security issues that are pressured from external actors. Same can be said for Ukraine in that regards. It is something that we have to take in consideration when understanding that internal dynamics, how we approach peace talks, have an effect on how we're going to look on these things down the line, 20, 30 years from now. The problem with this thing is that there seems to be no real objective and long-term vision on how do we incorporate both Bosnia and Ukraine in NATO as full-fledged members. This leaves obviously the status up in the air, too shaken to deal with it. So, following the Bosnian example, in which an internal peace agreement has essentially rendered the security status perpetually destabilized in the Bosnian case.
Could I make a point here?
Absolutely.
I just want to underscore what you're saying. Everyone needs to know on the Dayton Peace Agreement and the architecture of governing the country in this under this accord includes Russia in the Peace Implementation Council that oversees civilian implementation of
Yes.
the accords. And so you actually have an enemy or a belligerent inside your government. Russia has not signed a communique by the Peace Implementation Council since 2012. They refuse to sign.
Yes.
That's just one example,
Yes,
but
yeah.
yeah, but that tells you just how tenuous the situation is. And Ismet is quoted these ambassadors. These were straight on threats to Bosnian sovereignty. It was very shocking when they were rendered. So at the time the agreement was made, this was during the time of Yeltsin.
Yes.
And Yeltsin was seen by Bill Clinton as a constructive partner. I was actually working in Sarajevo when the Russian brigade in Bijeljina broke for the airport in Kosovo during the '99 war.
Yes.
And there was fears by the UK that we were going to start the Third World War at that time. So these things are very precarious, very fragile. And you haven't talked about EUFOR, but in
Well, we can touch
in terms of Kosovo, they are reinforced with the NATO presence at Camp Bondsteel, and Bosnia has EUFOR, which is guaranteed by Europe, but it is lightly armed. There's no heavy weapons available to them. And given what is going on in Ukraine and the statements by the President of the United States, I believe it has now transcended the situation, rendering NATO on the margins. Because if the United States isn't leading NATO, there really is a weak NATO. And the UK and France can be constructive partners, the Dutch too, but we're talking about the President of the United States has basically upended the post-World War II world order, and it is really, really precarious. So this talk comes at I said to Ismet, this talk comes on the heels of a move that none of us have ever witnessed before, a President of the United States changing our foreign policy in the middle of a war. And this is really, really precarious in how it will affect Bosnia and Herzegovina and the rest of the Western Balkans.
I mean, in many ways, Professor was very, very astute in some of these points. I will just end with the following, and that is that, you know, the Bosnian case is almost an example of how internal dynamics can shape external security factors. And if you were to look into the Bosnian case, Ukraine would be smart not to accept any kind of peace deal that goes along the same lines that happened in the Bosnian case, unless that peace deal directly addresses the existential security threats of the Ukrainian state, including the fact of the issue of physical borders at the end of the day. Because if we are indeed witnessing the United States disinvestment, you know, in the European security framework, we have this idea that the big powers are now free to redraw borders of the smaller ones. And this is something that has stood at the core, and I say this here as well. If we really come to the point that there's no permanent alliance, that there's no firm commitments to what we have put in the charters, that there's a now understanding of a unilateral defense of national interests, then that goes against the direct cores that have been central force to what the United States has built in the 20th and the 21st century, you know, and that is the prohibition of acquiring territories through coercion or through force. And this will lead, regardless of what happens in the meantime and in the near future, this will lead states such as Ukraine, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina, to look for security arrangements beyond NATO, not necessarily to discard NATO, but to look for security arrangements that will be able to offer some kind of ironclad assistance, whatever that means, some kind of guarantees, as a way of solving these existential issues. Now, whether those will be bilateral frameworks, whether those will be multilateral, whether that will be some type of a new alliance of the willing in Europe, I think if we are essentially witnessing a real shift in U.S. position towards this pillar, then we will see inevitably a clash between two sides of the Atlantic in how we approach further this issue. And second, it will, in many ways, which might not be even the worst outcome, will force a European strategy on Ukraine, on the Balkans, on Bosnia and Herzegovina. It will make, in some ways, absolutely pertinent, necessary for Europe to take control, to organize, to demonstrate that they can take care of their environment. And in that regards, we'll try to reshape the current balance of power in the continent. And I'll stop with that.
That's great. That's wonderful. Just a minute. I just want to make a couple other points. China is playing a bigger and bigger role in the region. They use money, they use loans to leverage their foreign policy. The Yellow Bridge from Zagreb, from Croatia to Bosnia's Herzegovina is one example of how the EU opened the door to China and allowed China to build a bridge with EU money, and there was no consultation with Bosnia, very little. Secondly, I would just add that obviously Russia plays a big role in the region, but we didn't talk about the Croats. And the Croatia is a EU member and is a member of NATO. And they absolutely are burning the tarmac down to Moscow. They are definitely leaning more and more pro-Russia. And now 2 of the NATO members in the Western Balkans, North Macedonia and Montenegro, have elected pro-Russian governments in the past year. So that gives you a overview that is very, very precarious. And one of the concerns we have is, let's say Mr. Trump goes all in and pulls out completely on the Ukraine deal. You mentioned it, Ismet, but we could see a scenario like Transnistria, where there's a move from Belgrade on Kosovo, and also Mr. Dodik has threatened secession repeatedly for over a decade. So you could see a move there. Russia doesn't need to put MiGs up in the air or put tanks on the ground. They're already in control in terms of disinformation. Their media outlets are in the RS, they're in Serbia. So there's nothing to convince anybody of. They don't need to move weapon systems. So
I would just add to that something very, very interesting that I think is important. One is the fact that we have seen this and has been spoken about publicly, and that is the increased rhetoric of the Balkan leaders, that they essentially are looking for signals not from Moscow, but rather what the United States does in the region, or what the new presidency or the new president will do, stating basically that if there's a laid-back approach, lukewarm approach of the United States towards this issue, that they will continue, or they will push for final secession. That's one thing. The second thing is, if something such as Ukraine was to happen, a partition plan of Ukraine was to happen, there is no doubt that this is a signal, among else, to Moscow, but also to Serbia, to Croatia to a certain extent, that what has been allowed in Ukraine can easily be allowed in the Balkans. And finally, what Professor said, I think a big dimension is the arms procurement that's happening.
Oh, yes, yeah.
The arms procurement that's happening from both China and Russia. There's been a huge surge of weapons bought from Balkan states, especially Serbia, and to a certain extent the entity of Republika Srpska, buying new systems of China and Russia. If I'm not wrong, Serbia is the only country in Europe who possesses a working anti-air defense system from China. including drones. There's an office of the Russian Ministry of Defense embedded within the Serbian Ministry of Defense. So there is no need, and nobody expects any kind of troops, Russian troops in the Balkans. There's no need for that. I have positioned this, and I have stood behind the argument that nowhere else in the European collective security framework is Russia able to foment more crises for NATO with less resources invested than in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is something that is positioned in a way in which there doesn't need to be significant investments for cataclysmic events to happen.
Yeah, this is in plain view. Mr. Jodik threw a celebration party when Mr. Trump was reelected. So there is no, this is brazen, it's in your face, and they're waiting for whatever nod they get, whatever move is made in Washington towards the region. I remain deeply concerned about what will happen on the ground. So let's open it up. And I know you had your hand up
Yes.
first.
My name is Jim Dingman. I'm a broadcast colonel. Obviously, the past 2 weeks have been absolutely disgraceful.
Mhm. Yes.
To see the vice president after a speech in Munich kowtow to neo-Nazis in Germany.
Yes.
So the worst case scenario is on us right now. The United States, I mean, I've seen the Russian talking heads talking about an alliance with Russia, to usurp NATO. So again, the question for Americans is, what's going to stop this? And will the Congress, which has good and bad aspects to it, or one aspect to it, or the people in this country, which frankly I think is what's going to have to happen, because they're getting hit domestically. They're now talking about threatening Medicare and Medicaid. That will, trust me, that will cause a big revolt in this country if that's where Trump's going. But I'm just wondering, let's just assume the worst case on this. Because you're talking about NATO, and then we're watching NATO essentially as a foreign policy objective of Trump, which in the first term wanted to pull out of. We see in all the accounts. He actually had, when Esper was replaced, he had the replacements of Esper writing to withdraw everybody simultaneously from Europe. So let's assume that happens. How do you see all this? I mean, just let's talk about the worst case scenario of this stuff going on now.
Well, despite the obvious points you've stated, I still think that we need to work with the United States. This is one thing. Now, how successful that will be, that's a different issue. What I think here is there's short-term and long-term consequences. Short-term consequences is that this is a profound, fundamental shift in security of the Western order, point blank. Short-term, this also means that there's going to be significant costs to be borne. Part of it is, yes, credibility of the United States, whether it can be trusted. Part of it is, yes, there's going to be probably certain security vacuums that are going to be targeted by others. Long term, I do think that this is going to, at the very least, jolt a serious effort in European capitals about talking about what we need to do to, at least to the extent that is possible in short to medium term, enhance our capacities to not be put in this situation again. This is already what has been talked about in certain capitals. You see Macron gathering the leaders. There's going to, and I think that there's going to be a reckoning along the lines that as long as this president is here, and if this policy is the continuation of his foreign policy goals, there's going to be a serious strategic reorientation of how do we think about security in Europe. And that cost will have to be borne primarily by Europeans. This is what I think is going to be the result of if everything breaks loose. Now, there are mechanisms that have been put already in place by institutional cooperation, U4 was mentioned by Professor. There is the idea of the Article 42.7 of the EU charters that is essentially equivalent to Article 5. Whether that will work, nobody knows. Everybody is now in a fog of how do we approach this issue. But what I think is the most prominent issue is where do we find the balance between still having the United States a member of NATO and productive or constructive member of NATO, and where do we work or how do we work on building European capacity to deter actors? This is something that I think is very important. At the end of the day, I really do not think that the United States soldiers should lay their lives for issues that are primarily European at the end of the day. This is my position. I think that there needs to be a reckoning, despite what's happening now, that part of the responsibility is, and I call this strategic procrastination of the Europeans throughout years, in finally waking up and assuming part of the burden. This is something that, now the problem here is the way this has been done by this administration has been questionable, to say the least. And this has produced, obviously, a lot of skepticism, fear, instability, insecurity in European partners are simply not ready at this moment.
I will just add one thing. Mr. Trump won't be able to pull us out of the NATO treaty. It's a 3/4 vote out of both houses.
Yes.
And he won't have the votes to do that, but he can emasculate it, he can marginalize it. And basically what he said to the Europeans through his vice president is that you're on your own. This is in your hands, Europe. And I know that they're reeling, and I'm sort of surprised by it because I always took him at his word. I always took him at his word about how he was going to approach Europe on wars, and he is obviously an isolationist and does not want to engage. So I'm very, very, very concerned, and believe me, those of us who have been advocates or analysts or people that work on the region, if they're not going to save Ukraine from Russia, they're certainly not going to save the Balkans. And keep in mind, the first and last war of the 20th century was fought in the Balkans. So all I want to say is this is an unbelievable situation right now. And the Europeans, it'll be interesting to see how the UK gets involved, how they engage, because I think the strongest partnership in the Balkans is the UK-US partnership.
Yes.
And that's unfortunate. We'll see what happens here.
Yes.
And I actually, at New Lines Institute, my boss happens to be a UK citizen, and we were having a conversation about that this week. So it's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out because it's a Labour Party now in London. So we'll see.
I just wanted to add the optics of what
Please.
we're associating ourselves with Tim Shanley and Andrew Jackson in 1832 and having a modern Trail of Tears by moving 2 million people from Gaza.
Sure.
I mean, these are all kind of whoever this kind of nuttiness would occur. And so it's very unpredictable to figure out where it's going to land, because that, especially in America with that kind of policy, I don't ever think I've ever heard anybody talk about solving the Middle East crisis with this kind of option. So that's another little monkey wrench to throw into the kitty there.
No, it's definitely taking up a lot of room. I would add, it's interesting, Netanyahu followed right up on what Trump said, and he's all in on this idea, but the president of Israel is not, and called it a war crime, which it is. Herzog is actually a pretty reliable human being. That's the exception though, right now in that government. Okay, yes, Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a master's student here at the Harriman Institute. I wanted to ask you a bit about Hungary's position, both within U4 as the commander of troops there and within NATO as well,
Yes.
given how close Orban is to Dodik. Do you interpret this as just kind of playing to their domestic bases, Or is Orban trying to move Dodik away from Russia? What's going on there?
No, I would actually argue the other way around. I would say that the European Union itself now, this has been just perhaps sidelined to a certain degree because there's more glaring issues happening. But there is this fundamental dichotomy in the European Union itself between the so-called democracies and illiberal democracies, in which the rise of far right has been a serious issue to internal cohesiveness and functionality of the European continent or the EU itself. Part of that, or not just part of it, one of the leaders of that bloc is Orban. And Orban essentially is producing allies that he can count on in his fight against what he calls the EU establishment, the EU elites. Which is a similar rhetoric to what we heard here in the United States the past years. So he is definitely a player, an actor that has positioned himself again astutely, using the best of both worlds in terms of exploiting the prerogatives and benefits of being an EU member, withdrawing large amounts of funds, the support that the EU gives to member states, and then on the other side, undermining these same checks and balances that have been in place, and in that process, finding allies that share these viewpoints with him. And then you have this trifecta, essentially, Moscow, Budapest, Banja Luka, or if you want Square, add Belgrade in there as well, that coordinate these policies that have maximum capacity for creating instabilities. So I think that we will see a rise of these issues, especially along the lines of what is the guiding principle of European security order in the next decade. If we continue this path in which there's no clear response, the level of polarization that will arise from these, and we already see this Sunday, Germany is going through an election that could possibly change the face of the German state, obviously, but also where the European continent is headed. If we don't give answers to these important, complex questions, I think the level of polarization, the rise of far right, the rise of these populist leaders will increase. And not only will they increase, they will become bolder, they will become more aligned in fomenting crisis along the lines of what they have so far talked about, what the European project needs to look, which is much more discriminational towards differences, which is much more isolationist, etc. So
There's a lot of cooperation. Keep in mind, Mr. Orban was the advisor on Project 2025 in this country that is being implemented by his fellow radical right. Orban is he's played it very interestingly. I mean, the Republicans have been going to CPAC in Budapest, my friends. So this is really in your face. They're cooperating. Let's don't forget Turkey here. Erdogan is a player as well. And so they're all cooperating with one another. The bad guys are, just to be basically straightforward, they're all working together. So Erdogan was invited to the inauguration. And he said he was thinking about coming. He didn't finally, in the final analysis, he didn't come. But also Trump invited Xi. So let's look at this with open eyes and not try to delude ourselves. Yes.
My name is Kyle. I'm one of the directors of the International Strategy Forum. But I just have a quick question about timeline, I guess is maybe my question. I think in the United States, you've seen that a lot of these changes are happening very rapidly.
Right.
And law, as we sort of know it on the international stage, moves very slowly. Kind of talked about wanting to make it so that Europe's thinking about other deterrents and how do we kind of work together. I can imagine that would take an extremely long time when it comes to Europe as well. Do you think we're playing against the clock? Do you think that there is a pretty long runway that we have before, I don't know, additional sort of military action starts in place? Or I guess what does that kind of look like in?
Well, that's a very difficult question, first and foremost. But I would say that the response to that one stands between two lines. One is I think it's contingent upon what the final positions of the negotiations in Ukraine become. This is what it boils down to. The European, my sense of understanding from the European capitals is that whether they are prepared or not prepared, all of them will face some type of consequence, and that will cost. Now, you have already within the EU itself, within the European continent, countries that are relatively, I don't want to say prepared, but have done a number of things to possibly preemptively find a solution to this. Poland is one example. Who's thinking about 5% of GDP expenditure on defense issues. Poland, who was until recently a serious issue for the European Union itself and their far-right government. That was
in the past.
Yes.
Recent past.
Now there's the Donald Tusk is in charge. So there are governments that are doing so. Now, I understand positions of Professor Domi on Turkey. I would state one thing. Turkey is one of the very few countries who has, after the full fiasco that's just happened with Ukraine, gone on record to state that it absolutely, without any second guessing, supports the entirety of the Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. This is something that's a very important statement from a player that carries increased regional relevance. And understanding that the solution to Ukraine can come without the work of Turkey is delusional. Turkey is a power that lies on the Black Sea and is part of what has been a strategic positioning of Turkey in the region and globally. The ability to mediate these conflicts. So I think that the timeline looks in a way that some will be caught completely, but there are countries that are going to be that are already working on finding a solution. Now, I don't think that negotiations happen fast. History has taught us that these take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. The Bosnian negotiation took 4 years, for the love of God. It's a small country. Imagine what it would be doing in terms of the Ukrainian scenario. So there is time, but obviously there needs to be already a reckoning that things need to move in that direction. Now, what the models will look like, nobody knows. But I think that there's going to be an understanding. And now, it's easy to be a general after the battle, but Macron's strategic, what is the term he used? Strategic relevance of the European Union that he wanted to build. It sounded funny and illusional back then, but today it sounds much more necessary and needed than it was back then. So we will see. I think a special and very important role falls on the UK. The UK, who is obviously the connections between the United States and UK are very well understood, but UK was still an European continental power. That's it. It's an island, but it's part of the European continental security framework. And it will, in one way or the other, be affected by events in Europe. And in that regards, it will want to shape events that happen in Europe. I'm not surprised, individually speaking, of Starmer's position on UK troops in Ukraine. It's an understandable way. It's a continuity of historic policies in which UK has opposed Russian expansionism, imperial ambitions, and it's also the role of UK as a security guarantor on the European continent. So I think there's a pronounced role for them, obviously with European powers supporting that. What's your maybe?
No, I think that the situation, people here may not know that there was an attack, between Serbia and Kosovo, a year and a half ago, the Banska attack. And it also, before that attack, there was an attack on NATO peacekeepers in Kosovo. So there's been things happening in the Balkans that a lot of people aren't really watching that closely. And when Milorad Dodik is watching every word that Trump is speaking, and right now, what's interesting about the situation in the Balkans, though, is that Mr. Vučić is really tied down in a domestic upheaval that's actually going pro-democracy, which is really inspiring, led by high school students. And it has sustained itself since November, the prime minister resigning in the near of Novi Sad, which is probably one of the most progressive communities in Serbia. This is something really to watch and hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves, but there was an article on the front page of the New York Times about a couple of weeks ago about what's happening. It has to do with endemic corruption. And these kids are really taking a command in a way that is really remarkable. The EU has been slow to support. The US, of course, isn't saying anything. And as a matter of fact, Rick Grenell actually attacked the kids. Rick Grenell, the special envoy and now the current executive director of the Kennedy Center, actually attacked the kids and said they should be backing Mr. Vučić. And of course, they thumbed their nose at him. So everybody's coming out of this in the West kind of the wrong way. In the middle of everything that's so out of control, you have this spark of democracy and organizing that's just absolutely remarkable. But all that being said, Mr. Orban is a confidant of Mr. Trump. I mean, and Trump lied about Project 2025 throughout the entire campaign because he knew it was unpopular. He knew that. And he lied about it. So it'll be interesting, as Ismet discussed, about it in the next German elections. What's going to happen in Germany, which is powerful, one of the most powerful economies in Europe. And the most powerful economy. And unfortunately, this coalition government just did not work well. It just didn't really produce what it needed to do to meet the moment. The question is, can European leadership meet this moment? And we will see. And knowing how precarious the situation is in the Balkans, anytime there's some kind of trip wire, Vučić put MiGs up in the air over a border confrontation on license plates. So, I mean, anything can happen. It's crazy, it's very, very tenuous. And I don't think the US will do anything. They will do nothing. And they may even become a problem as well. And Mr. Kurti, who was just reelected as the prime minister of Kosovo, he's really angered the Americans because he doesn't take their advice, because he has 5 Serb municipalities within his borders that have been actors for disruption and violence. And the US and the EU said, oh, well, you made this agreement, so you're going to have to live with it. But it's actually, Kurti points to the RS in Bosnia and says, we don't want that in Kosovo. We know that's a problem for Kosovo. Yeah, so it's an interesting scenario that is fraught with all kinds of dangerous outcomes. And I feel right now that the people in power in the United States and even in Europe cannot meet this moment right now. They're going at it from a very undemocratic position. Yes,
So I watched the video, the interview of the, whatever the top. No, Mr. Parker talked to the Prime Minister of Hungary, Orban. And he asked a question saying, will you think the war will end in 6 months? And the Prime Minister saying, yeah, it will end. What is your view? Do you think it will end? Because he used the word, he's saying, strong man end the war.
Yeah.
And the weak man let it linger. So what is your view on that?
I think he doesn't know. And I think he doesn't know. I mean, I fail to understand or realize how will, whoever it is that is going to come up with a solution, how will this solution be imposed on the Ukrainians?
well, Zelensky's saying he's not going to accept anything that doesn't include Ukrainians at the table, and I don't blame him. I mean, it's his country and he was illegally invaded. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Because it's your country and we're talking about, I think it'll be a brutal partition. It'll be very brutal. You think what happened in Bosnia is unacceptable. What will happen in Ukraine will make it look like child's play, and we know what will happen to the victims. They'll probably, given the very, very, very unprofessional Russian army, add in the North Koreans on the ground, you're talking about people that don't know, that don't care, and their command leadership does not care about international law. I don't want to think about what will happen. I just don't
Yes.
want to contemplate that.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm a master's student at Columbia SIPA. And my question is, what do you think about the role of Baltic states in the European continental security?
I want to say one thing about that really quickly. I had an off the record conversation with some people that are involved in NATO, and there are a number of analysts who are participating, and we have been told that Poland has moved in a block inside NATO, a block that actually includes the Baltics, where Poland and the Baltics are working very closely together because they know that everything's on the line. Their borders line up across that region directly with Russia. And, Russia has invaded Georgia, and also has engaged in electronic attacks on Estonia, for example. That was a while ago, but it followed the Georgian War. So there's no fools over there in the Baltics. They know what they're facing, and Poland clearly understands the situation.
I think it's two things. One, they feel absolutely vindicated, and the second one, they feel absolutely terrified. Vindicated because for years, those who have followed the EU politics know that the Eastern Bloc or the Baltic Bloc, or even to a certain degree the Nordic Bloc, has often been sidelined or discarded whenever these positions were brought up. They were often called paranoid, sometimes you were warmongering, so they feel vindicated in a sense that they have shown that what they talk about is real and that these things matter. On the other side, they're terrified because these are the countries that are directly impacted by what's happened, So obviously somebody in Tallinn and in Latvia and in Vilnius is thinking, whether there's another invasion over the border, which is why you see that their words match their actions. They have, even though they're very small, very limited capacity, have supported Ukraine, for example, without any ifs or buts. Whatever they could have done in terms of resources they have put at disposal. So I think they're going to be a serious part of the discussion in a sense that their security will be understood serious. They will be part of the equation of how do we make sure that these countries do not go to the same scenario.
There any other
There's-
comments,
there's one.
question? Oh, sorry, didn't see you.
Anybody else? So how do you assess, the military situation in Ukraine? How do you view it? How do you assess, how is it assessed in Bosnia?
I mean, I'm not a military expert, but I mean, it's obvious it's a war of attrition. The Russians seem to be gaining footholds in certain areas. But the thing about the current status is that the Russian economy is almost completely at this point of time transferred in a wartime economy that has in minds of how to make this a long-term battle. I've actually read or listened to the former intelligence chief of Great Britain, the United Kingdom, who yesterday, I think, went on to perfectly encapsulate what's happening by stating that the state of the economy is dire, but if needed, the Russians could possibly, first of all, they already have battle-hardened troops that are fighting and know how to fight. And then the second thing is, it is not out of the domain of possibility to have this type of force recoup itself, remodernize itself in terms of in case of a peace plan, and then be able to sustain even longer incursions or longer wars in the upcoming decade. I think that summarizes well what can be expected on that side. I mean, regardless how you think about it, the Ukrainians have and the Ukrainian military has bore extraordinary costs and sacrifices for that. Now to be discarded essentially is not only morally, I mean, dishonest, but also on a strategic level, you basically greenlight an idea in which brutal invasion and killing, and at the end of the day, eradication of a certain territory brings benefits, brings results, victories.
I'm not that impressed with the Russians as a professional army. They couldn't even resupply it. They couldn't do an on-road, on the highway resupply of a convoy. So I don't know what they are bringing in now, but you know, they did reach out to the North Koreans because they were running out of soldiers. They've lost over 350,000, it's estimated. I've heard that number has been thrown around.
The chief intelligence says 800,000.
Really?
That's what the UK says.
Okay, well, I'm not aware, but that wouldn't surprise me because he doesn't face any public opinion that he's got to deal with. You're gonna make another comment?
Yeah, I've been working with, at Marine Corps University. There's been, these guys are working in a classified environment down there. But there's been an ongoing project now for several years, about the war. I would not say that the Russians have definitely learned the hard way.
Yeah.
They've improved their force structure. The North Koreans just moved in, approximately like,
2 months ago.
probably 10 to 15 battalions of artillery and multiple rocket launchers to support their troops on coast. And they're learning too. So it's not like they're not learning. And what you said, like, see, what always blows my mind is the calculations that must be going on down there in Washington. You've got 110 brigades fighting against 220, plus 5 to 6 more divisions are going to be up there in Belarus. And they want to just sort of throw these guys into the garbage. This is what really sort of I find, it's like Czechoslovakia. in 1930, it's truly mind-boggling.
I'm sure a lot of people in the Pentagon are absolutely gobsmacked over these events. Because, I mean, full disclosure, I served in the United States Army for 15 years, so I'm very well acquainted with what it means to be in a military, in an army. And I'm sure that, you know, given the really strong support by the Biden administration for Ukraine, and we have to give Europe some credit. They've invested too. They've given more actually than the US has
Yes.
in total.
Yes.
So that is a good thing, and Europe knows what they're facing here. They are awake. I just think they're reeling because of the quick shift
Yeah.
out of Washington.
I served 3 years, and there's
Yeah.
kids here who are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, who have friends who have been killed.
Right.
I can think of several. So, I mean, this is having a tremendous
No,
effect.
this
It's
is-
really up to us as American to rectify this situation.
Well, the other aspect to this is, speaking of public opinion, is that 81% of the American public supported Ukraine when this invasion began. And it was supported pretty consistently by the American population in terms of polling. Yes.
I have one more question. Do you think the US will lift sanctions against Russia as part of negotiations? And do you think
That,
are sanctions critical to deterring Russia from aggression?
that's already been discussed and
And
between-
done.
and basically
Yeah.
committed to putting it on the table, which is one of the unbelievable things. Before the even actual negotiations start, you give up one of the strongest levers you have in corrective behavior in that regard. So yes, on the sanctions, and they have been proven to have significant impact.
I don't see any new sanctions coming out of the Trump government
That's
at all. It's not gonna happen. That's his friend. He looks at him as his friend. And the other part of the sanction, I think in terms of Treasury sanctions, those are very effective. The other ones, I'm not so convinced, and I still don't know enough about the sanctions protocols, for example, in the Balkans, because there's been a lot of sanctions. But when they're economic, I think they do change some behavior, but Dodik has been sanctioned by the UK and the US, twice by the US, and it still hasn't stopped him from calling for secession over and over and over.
It's done a significant damage to the regime, though, especially the most recent ones in which compliance started kicking in. Basically, the United States started demanding compliance of the executive orders that have been issued in the sanctions list. And once these compliance compliance demands were
I'm sure he
ordered,
has less money now.
he has less money. It's
Yeah.
becoming harder to
Yeah.
retain loyalty among people who got affected because
That's
of
right.
secondary.
I said, once they
Yes,
started going after
Yes.
the money, that's when there is some change.
Yes, exactly.
If there wasn't, the hit they wanted to get on the economy, they didn't get. They wanted to get a 10% hit on the GDP. It only got 3%, so you.
I mean, Russia's
No, no, no.
GDP is smaller than, I mean, Italy has a bigger economy than Russia. I mean, so I think the economy is one of Russia's greatest weaknesses. Quite frankly, I mean, they're still selling oil and they're going to make money off of oil and they can fund the war. But in terms of its overall economy, and Trump just said, well, we're gonna bring them back to the G8. And I was like, really? Really? So, if there aren't any more questions, we could keep talking about this. Any more questions? Because we have 10 minutes left. Okay.
Alright, I forgot to introduce
Sure.
myself. Cindy Yan Huali, I'm an alumni of Columbia University. So another question, I'm curious, what is the current polling of the American, the American people? Are they continue supporting this war or not?
The Ukraine war,
Yeah,
I
the
haven't
Ukraine
looked
war,
at
right.
recent Gallup
No.
polling, But it's been pretty consistent that it was backed.
I don't know.
But with Trump going negative and calling Zelensky a criminal, you know, that could definitely affect polling. Look at go look at Gallup. It'll give you a good idea. Yes, Elaine.
Sorry, on Bosnia,
Mhm.
I agree that secession of the RSNT is a huge threat that's becoming more likely over time, and that the current constitutional situation is kind of like a perpetual deadlock.
Mhm.
So, do you have like a positive vision for what Bosnia could become, what change is possible, or?
That's a funny question, because before I came here, I actually held a series of lectures on a Dayton 2.0 roadmap. Which is basically a answer to your question: what are some of the avenues we can take in order to make the Bosnian state more functional? And there is possibilities. The first one is to deal with the acute security threat, and this is where other bilateral and multilateral arrangements come across. I published with Professor Domi something called a new security pact for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is supposed to take a quadrilateral framework of support to offset the lack of NATO integration for Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to buy time for more significant reforms. But the best way to do so is through the support towards the European Court of Human Rights rulings on the Bosnian state. Those offer the avenue.
Those.
Exactly. Those
Yeah.
offer avenue how you modernize the Bosnian state. There's levers there. They're chosen not to be used. The OHR can be a more productive actor than it currently is. You know, it cannot meddle with the constitution itself, but it can create an environment in which a number of things can be done. You know, can it impose certain laws, certain decisions that will allow for an easier passing of the amendment.
The High Representative missed his moment to do that.
Yes.
I would just add that our colleague Yasmin Mujanovic, who's a colleague of mine at New Lines Institute, launched today on the Hill a new Dayton Plus initiative with the support of Senator Peter Welch and Mike Turner, who's actually Republican and represents the Dayton area. You know, we'll see. I mean, you can have a couple of members of Congress, but I'm not sure that's going to move the kind of reform we need. It's got to be, at this point in time, I do not see any appetite by the Americans, even though it is their legacy, to help reform Bosnia once and for all. And I agree with this entirely. There's been 6 decisions by
Seven now.
7 now, that's right.
Kovacic.
Yeah, that's right, Kovacic. There's been 7 decisions by the European Court of Human Rights that the High Representative should have said, I agree with the court and I'm going to impose them. But instead he undercut the Bosniak vote and went into a deal with the Croats, and that's another subject for another time. But
Yes. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Q has a mixed bag poll about public opinion, just taking a week ago.
Which one?
Q does,
Pew's got one on Ukraine.
that's right, and it's a mixed bag.
It's a mixed bag.
Mixed bag.
Well, I think it's probably gotten, you know, it's gonna get
Thank you.
muddied up some. It's going to be muddied up already. It has been.
I got a doubt is also 1/3.
Yeah, but it was very strong for a while. It's these are unbelievable events. These are just, it's unbelievable, and it's gonna take a time for us to see like actually how it falls out, but it does not look good with this kind of positioning of the United States, who is the leader of NATO. It's as someone who's worked in 12 countries, worked for the State Department, served in the Army, I can honestly say I am ashamed of what has transpired in the past 2 weeks.
So there's no check and balance.
Well,
First,
Mr. Trump is essentially governing as if he is a king. And the Article 1 of the Constitution is the separation of powers between the Congress and the executive, and the Article 1 has, the Republican Party has absolutely collapsed in terms of enforcing its role in its separation from the executive. I also worked on the Hill too, by the way. I was a congressional aide. So this is, it's just, I've never seen anything like it. No one has ever seen anything like it. It's never happened before, not like this.
Just
That's
like
what Nixon would have done if Watergate happened.
That's right. Yeah, only Ruckelshaus told him, I won't, you know. The Saturday Night Massacre in comparison to what happened in New York this past week is child's play, because 7 prosecutors resigned. There was only 2 people who resigned under Nixon. All I can say is, all bets are off, you guys. It's a good time to be in grad school. That's what I want to say.
That's a good one.
I want to thank you so
Thank you very
much
much.
for coming. Thank you.
Yes. Absolutely.
More to come, more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and staying. You know, we really get down into the nitty gritty here. Not everybody really likes that.
That's.
timely.
Yeah, very timely,
Yeah.
fortuitous.
Very